There is something profoundly transformative in the moment a person decides they will no longer be a victim of the circumstances that surround them. It is in that precise instant that destiny ceases to be an external force and becomes a conscious choice, a silent declaration that the future will be written by one's own hands, no matter how adverse the present conditions may be. In Millbrook, Alabama, a town where time seemed to have stopped at some indefinite point between the past and a future that never arrived, this transformation was about to manifest in a way that no one could have predicted. The cobblestone streets, worn by time, told stories of generations who had been born, lived, and died within the same 8,000 square meters of territory, where everyone knew each other's secrets but pretended not to for the sake of social convenience. The town awoke every morning with the same ritual. The bell of the Methodist church echoing at 6 o'clock, followed by the noise of cargo trucks crossing the main street, carrying cotton to the northern factories. The air carried the sweet, heavy scent of magnolia mixed with the acrid aroma of asphalt heated by the relentless southern sun. It was a place where traditions were perpetuated not out of love, but out of inertia, where power was concentrated in the hands of a few families who had learned the art of maintaining control through a carefully calibrated combination of favors, intimidation, and complicit silence. Marcus Washington was 17 when he discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. On that September morning, as he walked through the halls of Millbrook High School, his steps echoed with the confidence of someone who had found his place in the world through books and the unwavering determination of his grandmother, Mama Ruth, who had raised him since he was 5 years old. His tall, slender body, which had grown almost 10 centimeters in the last year, moved with the natural grace of someone who had learned to take up space without apology. His dark skin, like polished ebony, reflected the fluorescent light of the hallways, and his deep brown eyes carried an intensity that made teachers stop to listen when he spoke about social justice in history class. His large, expressive hands gestured when he discussed civil rights, as if he could shape the future with his own fingers. Marcus had learned early on that education was his only weapon against a world that seemed determined to limit him. Mama Ruth, a 72-year-old woman whose wisdom had been forged in the furnaces of segregation and the civil rights struggle, would repeat every night before he slept that doing the right thing is not always easy, but it is always necessary. These words had become the mantra that guided every decision Marcus made, every choice he made between the easy path and the right path. On that specific morning, fate decided to test the depth of this conviction. Tyler Brennan was leaning against the lockers near the library, surrounded by his usual followers, when Marcus passed by carrying a pile of books on constitutional law that he had borrowed from the public library. Tyler, with his muscles developed by American football and the team jacket always impeccably positioned on his broad shoulders, represented everything that Millbrook considered valuable: physical strength, family connections, and the arrogance that came with the privilege of being born with the right last name. His ice-cold blue eyes fixed on Marcus with the kind of contempt that had been cultivated at home, fueled by dinner conversations where his father, Officer Robert Brennan, spoke of maintaining order and knowing everyone's place. The messy blonde hair and the small scar on his chin, a memento of a previous fight where he had emerged victorious, completed the image of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. The confrontation began in a seemingly casual way. Tyler stuck out his foot at the exact moment Marcus passed, causing the books to fly across the hallway in a shower of pages and scattered knowledge. The sound of the impact echoed through the hall, followed by the cruel laughter of Tyler and his friends. Marcus felt his knee scrape against the cold floor, but it was the humiliation that really hurt, the knowledge that dozens of students had witnessed the moment and chosen to look the other way. Tyler approached, his voice laced with the kind of venom he had learned to distill since childhood. He commented that perhaps Marcus should focus on sports instead of pretending to be smart, suggesting some books were too heavy for certain people to carry. The words were carefully chosen, coded in a way that allowed for plausible deniability, but whose real meaning was crystal clear to everyone present. It was at that moment that something fundamental changed within Marcus. It wasn't anger he felt, but a cold, calculated clarity, a sudden understanding that the time had come to choose between accepting the role that had been assigned to him or writing his own story. He stood up slowly, wiping the blood from his knee with the palm of his hand, and looked directly into Tyler's eyes. Marcus responded with a calm, controlled voice that Tyler had not expected. He said that the books were not too heavy, but that perhaps Tyler should try reading one someday, as ignorance seemed to be a much heavier burden to bear. The response was delivered without malice, but with a surgical precision that cut through Tyler's facade of superiority like a sharp blade. What happened next was inevitable. Tyler, accustomed to intimidating through physical presence and never having been intellectually challenged, reacted in the only way he knew how. He pushed Marcus against the lockers, expecting the usual submission he always got. But Marcus did not back down. Instead, something that had been dormant within him awakened completely. The fight that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but its repercussions would echo for years. Marcus, who had spent countless hours helping his neighbor, Mr. Johnson, fix cars in the auto shop, had developed a surprising strength in his long arms. More importantly, he had learned to think under pressure, to analyze situations quickly and find efficient solutions. Tyler, accustomed to winning through intimidation and body weight, discovered that technique trumped brute force. Marcus used Tyler's own momentum against him, applying an arm lock he had seen in a documentary about martial arts. The result was Tyler on the floor, immobilized and humiliated in front of an audience that had never imagined witnessing such a reversal of power. The silence that followed was deafening. Students who had spent years watching Tyler intimidate others were paralyzed, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Marcus stood up, straightened his shirt, and began to pick up his books as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But everyone knew that something fundamental had changed in the power dynamics of Millbrook High School. Tyler remained on the floor for a few seconds longer than necessary, not because of the physical pain, but because of the humiliation of being defeated by someone he had completely underestimated. When he finally got up, his eyes carried a promise of retaliation that Marcus recognized immediately. But there was something else. For the first time in his life, Tyler had experienced real fear, the feeling of being completely helpless in the face of someone stronger. The news of the confrontation spread through Millbrook with the characteristic speed of small towns, where information travels faster than light and is transformed with each retelling. By the time it reached the ears of Officer Robert Bobby Brennan, it had already been amplified and distorted into a narrative of public humiliation that threatened the reputation of the family he had spent decades building. Bobby Brennan was a man whose physical presence commanded immediate attention. At 45, his portly body and the prominent belly that stretched his navy blue uniform spoke of years of unchallenged power and meals paid for by local merchants eager to maintain good relations with the law. His military-style gray hair and thick mustache framed a face that had learned to use intimidation as its primary tool. The sunglasses he wore, even indoors, were not just a fashion accessory, but a psychological barrier that prevented others from reading his intentions. His hands, marked with scars from interrogations that had never been officially documented, trembled slightly when he was angry, a sign that the locals had learned to recognize and fear. Bobby had built his power in Millbrook through a careful combination of favors, intimidation, and the ability to turn a blind eye to certain activities in exchange for absolute loyalty. He knew everyone's secrets in town, who was having extramarital affairs, who was evading taxes, who had problems with drinking or drugs. This knowledge was his currency, and he used it with the precision of a surgeon. When he learned of Tyler's humiliation, Bobby felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the feeling that his control was being questioned. It wasn't just about his son, it was about what that incident represented. If a black kid could publicly humiliate a Brennan without consequences, what kind of message did that send to the rest of the town? What kind of precedent did it set? That night, Bobby sat in his leather armchair in the living room, a glass of bourbon in his hand, and his mind working furiously to develop a strategy. His wife, Margaret, a woman who had long ago learned not to question her husband's methods, served dinner in silence, recognizing the signs that Bobby was planning something. Tyler, still dealing with the day's humiliation, tried to explain what had happened, but Bobby interrupted him with an impatient gesture. He told his son he wasn't interested in excuses, but in solutions. He explained that in Millbrook, reputation was everything, and that allowing such disrespect to go unnoticed would be the same as inviting others to challenge the family's authority. Bobby had grown up in an era when racial lines were clearly defined and strictly maintained. Although times had officially changed, he had never really accepted these changes. For him, the natural order of things required certain people to remain in their designated places, and Marcus Washington had clearly forgotten what his place was. The strategy Bobby developed that night was both simple and diabolical. He couldn't just arrest Marcus without cause, as that would draw unwanted attention. Instead, he would begin a campaign of systematic intimidation, using his badge and authority to make the boy's life a living hell. Every minor infraction would be magnified, every move would be monitored, every opportunity for public humiliation would be exploited to the fullest. Bobby knew that the constant pressure would eventually break Marcus, forcing him to make a real mistake that would justify more drastic action. It was a game of patience, but Bobby had played similar games before and had always won. After all, he had all the power of the law on his side, and Marcus was just a black kid in a small town in Alabama. What Bobby couldn't foresee was that Marcus Washington was not like the other young men he had intimidated in the past. The education Mama Ruth had provided him, combined with the determination forged in adversity, had created something Bobby had never faced before. Someone who saw injustice not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a problem to be solved through the careful application of knowledge, strategy, and infinite patience. The war between Bobby Brennan and Marcus Washington was about to begin, but it would be fought on a battlefield that neither of them had chosen, with rules that would be written as the conflict unfolded. And at the center of it all was a fundamental question that would define not only the fate of two men, but the future of an entire town. What happens when an immovable force meets a truly irresistible object?
The persecution began subtly, almost imperceptibly to those who were not paying attention. For Marcus, however, it was like an invisible web that tightened with each passing day. Police stops became routine, stopped on the street on his way to school, questioned about his destination when leaving the library, searched for no apparent reason while waiting for the bus. Each encounter was a performance carefully orchestrated by Bobby Brennan, designed to humiliate and intimidate. The curious glances of neighbors, the whispers that followed, the feeling of being a public spectacle, all of this was part of the officer's plan. Bobby Brennan, with his prominent belly and the cynical smile that never reached his eyes, seemed to enjoy every moment. He always found a pretext, a burned-out brake light on Marcus's bicycle that didn't exist, an anonymous complaint of excessive noise coming from Mama Ruth's house, a supposed violation of a curfew that only applied to Marcus. The words were always the same: "Just doing my job, kid. Keeping order in Millbrook." But the tone, the look behind the sunglasses, the way he lingered, all screamed a different message. You are not welcome here. You do not belong. Marcus felt the weight of the town on his shoulders. Millbrook, which had once been his home, now felt like a prison. With each stop, with each humiliation, the anger grew. But Mama Ruth, with her ancestral wisdom, taught him to channel that energy. Anger is a fire, my son, and you can use it to burn or to forge. Choose wisely what you will build with it. She reminded him that true strength was not in retaliating with violence, but in overcoming, in rising above the pettiness and injustice. The decision to leave Millbrook was not easy, but it became inevitable. The full scholarship to Howard University in Washington, D.C. was not just an academic opportunity, it was an escape, a chance to breathe different air, to be in a place where the color of his skin was not an invitation to persecution. The farewell to Mama Ruth was painful, a tight hug that contained years of love, sacrifice, and hope. She watched him leave with teary eyes, but with a proud smile, knowing that she was sending her grandson to a future she had dreamed of for him. Washington, D.C. was a world apart from Millbrook. The vastness of the city, the diversity of people, the intellectual effervescence of Howard, all of this was a balm to Marcus's soul. He immersed himself in his studies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The laws, the precedents, the philosophy behind justice, every class, every book, every debate in the library was a tool he was sharpening for a greater purpose. He wasn't just learning the law, he was learning to use it as a weapon against the injustice he had experienced firsthand.
The flashbacks of Millbrook were constant, but they did not torment him. They motivated him. The image of Bobby Brennan's cynical smile, the feeling of helplessness during the stops, the humiliation of Tyler on the school floor, all of this turned into fuel. He remembered Mama Ruth's words that anger could forge, and he was forging a future where no one else in Millbrook would have to go through what he had gone through. During his years in law school, Marcus distinguished himself not only for his intelligence, but for his passion for social justice. He participated in legal clinics that defended the rights of marginalized communities, worked on cases of police brutality, and dedicated countless hours to understanding the nuances of the legal system. His professors saw him as a promising young man with a bright future in law, but Marcus had other plans. The call of Millbrook was too strong to ignore. The idea of returning to his hometown, not as the persecuted boy, but as an agent of change, began to take shape in his mind. He knew it would be a challenge, that he would face resistance, but the satisfaction of bringing justice to the place that had shaped him was an irresistible force. The opportunity arose when a position for municipal judge opened up, a position that, in small towns like Millbrook, had considerable power over local issues, including police conduct. The decision to apply was met with surprise by his colleagues and mentors. Many advised him to pursue a career in a larger city, where his talent would be more recognized and the opportunities would be greater. But Marcus knew that his purpose was not fame or money, it was justice. He wanted to be the change he wished to see in Millbrook. The selection process was rigorous, but Marcus was prepared. His intelligence, his passion, and his experience in civil and constitutional law set him apart from the other candidates. He spoke of the importance of a fair and impartial judicial system, of the need for accountability for those who hold power, and of his vision for a Millbrook where the law was applied equally to all, regardless of their last name or skin color. He did not mention Bobby Brennan directly, but the officer's shadow loomed over his words, a silent motivation that drove every argument.
When the news of his appointment reached Millbrook, the town was seized by a mixture of shock and apprehension. For many, it was proof that times were truly changing. For others, especially those who benefited from the status quo, it was a harbinger of trouble. The Brennan family in particular felt the impact of the news like a blow. Tyler, now a grown man who had inherited his father's arrogance, felt a chill run down his spine when he heard the name Marcus Washington. The humiliation of years ago still haunted him, and the idea of Marcus returning with such power was disturbing. Bobby Brennan, for his part, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and fury. He had spent years building his small empire of control in Millbrook, and the idea that the boy he had tried to break was returning as a judge was a personal insult. His small, calculating eyes, usually hidden behind sunglasses, gleamed with a contained rage. He refused to believe that Marcus, the boy he had persecuted and humiliated, could now have authority over him. Bobby's paranoia, which made him see conspiracies everywhere, now focused on Marcus. He saw the young man's return as a direct attack on his authority, an attempt to dismantle everything he had built. Marcus's return to Millbrook was discreet, but his presence was felt on every corner. The town seemed the same, but something had changed. People looked at him with a mixture of curiosity, hope, and, in some cases, fear. He was no longer the boy who had fled. He was Judge Washington, and his return promised a new era for Millbrook, an era where justice, long neglected, would finally have its voice.
The courtroom of Millbrook, a space that for decades had been the stage for routine decisions and at times silent injustices, now pulsed with a different energy. The dark wood of the benches, polished by time and use, seemed to absorb the tension that hung in the air. Marcus Washington, now Judge Washington, sat in the elevated chair, his black robe falling heavily on his shoulders, a symbol of authority that he carried with a serene gravity. His eyes, once those of a persecuted young man, now reflected the wisdom and firmness of one who had seen the abyss of injustice and decided to fill it with the light of the law. The first cases of police misconduct began to appear in court, brought by citizens who, encouraged by the presence of the new judge, finally found the courage to speak. They were stories of arbitrary stops, of unjust fines, of small abuses of power that, taken together, formed a pattern of oppression. Marcus listened to each testimony with meticulous attention, his analytical mind dissecting the facts, seeking the truth behind the words. He did not seek revenge but justice, and the difference was crucial. Revenge was personal, justice was universal. Bobby Brennan, Officer Brennan, watched everything from the back of the room. His portly presence and thick mustache framed a face that alternated between contained fury and a growing desperation. He had underestimated Marcus. He had believed that the boy would bow, that the town would swallow him back into its oblivion. But Marcus had not only returned, he had returned with the power to dismantle the empire of impunity that Bobby had built brick by brick. The sunglasses, once an impenetrable barrier, now seemed a desperate attempt to hide the fear that was beginning to corrode his facade of control. The final confrontation was inevitable, and it came in the form of the case of Samuel Jenkins, a young black man accused of contempt of authority after a violent stop by Bobby Brennan and his partner. The evidence was clear. Samuel had been assaulted without provocation, and the charge of contempt was an attempt to cover up the abuse. Bobby, confident in his ability to manipulate the system, expected the case to be dismissed like so many others before it. But Judge Washington was not like the others. He demanded that all the evidence be presented, that all the witnesses be heard. The courtroom was packed, the community of Millbrook watching every move, every word. When Samuel Jenkins, his face still marked by bruises, described the assault, Marcus's calm, firm voice filled the room, ensuring that every detail was recorded. It was time for Bobby Brennan's testimony.
He took the stand with his usual arrogance, his small, calculating eyes sweeping the room, looking for signs of weakness. He tried to intimidate Marcus with his gaze, but the judge remained impassive. Bobby began to narrate his version of the facts, a story full of half-truths and omissions constructed to justify his actions. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had never been truly questioned, of someone who had always gotten away with it.
Then Marcus asked the question that shattered Bobby's facade. With a voice that did not change in tone, but that carried the weight of years of injustice, he asked the officer if he remembered a young man named Marcus Washington and the stops he had made on that young man years ago. The question caught Bobby by surprise. His eyes widened for an instant. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He tried to compose himself, claiming that he did not remember all the young men he had stopped, that it was his job to maintain order. Marcus then, with a calmness that bordered on frightening, began to describe in detail some of the stops, the locations, the approximate dates, the exact words Bobby had used. He was not accusing, he was just remembering. But each memory was a blow to Bobby's shield of impunity. The courtroom was in absolute silence, except for the voice of Marcus, which seemed to echo the truth that everyone in Millbrook knew, but that no one dared to pronounce. Bobby Brennan, for the first time in his life, was speechless. His arrogance crumbled, revealing the terrified man behind the uniform. He tried to protest, but his voice failed him. The weight of his actions, of years of abuse of power, finally caught up with him. Judge Washington did not need to shout, did not need to humiliate. The truth, spoken calmly and precisely, was the most powerful weapon. At the end of the trial, the verdict was clear. Samuel Jenkins was acquitted of all charges. And in an unprecedented decision for Millbrook, Judge Washington recommended a full investigation into the conduct of Officer Robert Brennan, citing a pattern of behavior that violated the civil rights of citizens. The news spread like wildfire, and within days, Bobby Brennan was suspended and a federal investigation was launched. His empire of control had crumbled. Millbrook began to change. Justice, once an empty word, now had a face, the face of Marcus Washington. The community, once divided by fear and complacency, began to unite, to demand accountability, to build a different future. Marcus knew that the fight was not over. The change was a continuous process, but he had planted the seed. He had shown that education, integrity, and courage could, indeed, tear down the walls of oppression. The cycle of oppression had been broken, not with violence, but with the silent strength of the law and the determination of a man who refused to be defined by circumstances. The story of Marcus Washington became a reminder in Millbrook that true satisfaction does not lie in revenge, but in the restoration of order, in the assurance that the scales of justice, though slow, will always tip to the right side. And at the end of each day, as the sun set over Millbrook, Marcus Washington knew that he had done the right thing, and that this, in itself, was the greatest of rewards.